On Tuesday, April 14th, 1959, the block at the corner of East 103rd Street and Central Avenue in South Los Angeles woke to a sound everyone there recognized and, at the same time, feared. The moving truck choking in gear, the wooden floorboards complaining under the weight of boxes marked in pencil, tied with twine and paper tape, the way it was done when the move was cheap and time was short. It was not just another family arriving. It was the third in 2 weeks, and that changed the meaning of every noise. The mechanic who kept the shop open before the sun came up had already seen that rhythm speed up and knew what came with it. If the street changed hands too fast, the rent would change with it, and no one would have time to hold on to anything, in a time when leases were often month to month and a tenant's security depended more on custom than on real protection. The "For Rent" sign on the stucco building next to the barber had been flipped the night before. In the window, the outline of a new, cheap curtain with big flowers was already visible, hung without much precision, as if it had been bought in a hurry at a neighborhood store. The pressure did not come from a single blow, but from small, inevitable things that piled up. The price of milk rising by pennies and weighing on the end of the month, the cost of a retreaded tire, Sunday service, music leaking through windows, the way each family occupied the sidewalk. That was why it was worth staying to the end of this piece of history, to follow how an ordinary street, with its unwritten rules, reorganized itself when people from Arkansas and Texas arrived looking for work and brought another church, another music, another way of paying and owing, and how a single minute on a corner could seal destinies without needing funerals to leave a mark. Virgil Stokes' shop sat in a low, darkened brick building, with 2 bays and a metal door that rolled up with the groan of a spring and worn track. The paint on the sign, Stokes Auto Repair, was faded by the sun and by the smog that spring left a bitter taste in the air and a thin film on glass and chrome, demanding a damp rag to wipe it away. Virgil was 38, with thick hands stained with grease and a way of speaking little. He did not own much: a hydraulic lift that leaked and left stains on the concrete, a workbench with second-hand tools bought little by little, a tube radio that picked up KFWB poorly when a customer's engine was running and interfered with the static. What he truly had was the trust of someone who had lived there since the end of the war, when a neighborhood still held on to the same people for years, and turnover did not seem like the rule. He knew the sound of the milk truck, the ice cream man's whistle, the hour when the Pacific Electric streetcar no longer came through the way it used to, with lines being cut back and replaced by buses, the shift change of the Firestone tire plant farther south, and the flow of men going to and from General Motors in Southgate, at hours that marked the street like a clock. That morning, Virgil tightened the knot of the thin tie he wore to go to the bank, an old habit, even though the manager already called him by name, and stood watching the newcomers unload a mattress tied with rope, the fabric worn at the edges. The man was tall and thin, his hat crushed. The woman carried a baby on her hip, and a boy holding a little tin truck, the kind sold in drugstores and variety shops. The moving truck had Texas plates. Virgil watched the driver flick a cigarette but to the curb and crush it with his boot. It was a small gesture, but it said a lot, as if that street were temporary like the side of a highway, and not a place where people try to plant their lives. Across the way, on the porch of the light blue house, Mrs. Dottie Mays, a cook at a hospital in Watts, stopped to watch, her body still moving to the rhythm of long shifts and hot kitchens. Dottie was a widow, raised in Alabama, and she had turned that porch into an observation post, with a metal chair that squeaked and a heavy glass ashtray, the kind that did not tip in the wind. She knew nearly everyone's name and the history of every rent, who paid in cash, who left an envelope, who ran late and made up for it with an excuse. There was also Mr. Yamamoto, a gardener 2 houses down, with rose bushes lined up and a hose always coiled. He spoke little English, but nodded in greeting, keeping his yard as if order there were a form of protection. The block was a patchwork quilt of people who had come from somewhere and stayed out of necessity. And for that reason, any new arrival tugged at seams that had seemed firm until then. Late that afternoon, when Virgil closed the shop and walked to the market on 103rd to buy coffee and a can of 3-in-1 oil, the sound spilling from the new building was already different, as if the move had brought a different volume too. A radio playing Hank Williams very loud, the nasal voice cutting through the unscreened window and mixing with the noise of cars on Central. On the sidewalk, two neighborhood boys, used to listening to doo-wop and R&B on the corner, stopped and looked with suspicion. The older one, Leon Carter, worked at the post office depot and took pride in his collection of 45s, kept in paper sleeves and stacked carefully. Leon whistled a short phrase, not in admiration. Here, music was not just music. It sounded like a flag planted in concrete. The first Sunday after the move, April 19th, 1959, came with clear skies and a breeze that lifted fine dust from unswept streets, dust that collected in gutters and rose under tires. Sunday morning was the neighborhood's invisible clock. Women ironed shirts, men shined shoes, children were pulled by the hand to the right church, hair combed and clothes set aside since Saturday. There was Second Baptist on Central, a black church with a choir that rehearsed with discipline and that, when it sang, made windows vibrate. There was also a little Pentecostal church in a converted garage near 105th with improvised benches and poor ventilation, where the music was looser and the shouts came like a wave. Until then, each group knew where it fit, and those who went nowhere stayed home with the newspaper and the smell of bacon. That Sunday, the newcomers, the man with the crushed hat and the woman with the baby, did not walk to Second Baptist. They headed for the converted garage, guided by the sound of guitar and clapping. At the door, a white man with a worn Bible shook hands with exaggerated force, as if making welcome were a duty. A neighborhood girl, Sheila Mays, Dottie's daughter, watched from the sidewalk, curious. Sheila was 17, worked part-time at a diner on Avalon, and dreamed of saving enough to buy a sewing machine, something you paid for in installments or with months of saving. The music coming from the garage was fast, lively, and Sheila tapped her foot without noticing. Dottie grabbed her daughter by the arm and went on to Second Baptist with a closed face, as if the street were offering choices she did not want to have to make. Virgil was not a church-going man, but he respected Sunday the way one respects a street's quiet, when shops closed and the noise of tools gave way to low voices. He washed his hands, scrubbed the grease from under his nails with a stiff brush, and went to Dottie's house to fix a faucet that had been dripping for weeks, a drip that became a bill and an irritation. He found Dottie in the kitchen, clean apron on, the radio low on a gospel station, the volume restrained like a house rule. Dottie offered coffee. Virgil accepted. Through the window, they could see the Texas couple returning from the service in the garage, smiling, the boy running ahead. The man, Virgil later learned his name was Ray Henson, nodded, a quick greeting as if measuring the distance the street allowed. Dottie said, more to the air than to Virgil, that new people did not stay still, that they arrived, made noise, and changed the way everything worked. Virgil tightened the faucet nut and heard the dripping stop, knowing she was talking about more than water. Jobs were the force that pulled those families to Los Angeles like a silent magnet. At the end of April, Goodyear and Carson had announced openings, and word ran along the highways in letters and phone calls, and also through acquaintances who had gone before. Men from Arkansas and Texas arrived with promises of steady pay. Real estate offices, with glossy paper brochures and photos that hid cracks, pushed rentals on anyone who could pay the first week and the deposit when required. The owner of the stucco building next to the barber, Mr. Halpern, lived in Westwood and almost never appeared. He had sent the manager to collect rent in advance and to warn that repairs would be made when possible. Repairs there meant increases. Virgil saw it before everyone else because the manager, whose car always needed tuning, talked too much while he waited, as if the shop were also a conversation room. On Friday, May 1st, 1959, the manager showed up with a 1952 Ford that stumbled at low RPM and, while Virgil adjusted the carburetor, remarked, as if remarking on the weather, that rents in the area were lining up with the rest of the city. Virgil wiped his hands on a rag and asked what that meant. The manager shrugged and said that those paying $60 a month would start paying $75, maybe $80, small numbers on paper and enormous in life. A week of food or part of the electric bill. He also said there were people waiting, ready to move in, as if other people's waiting were argument enough to push out those already there. The news ran through the block like an electric current. It was not only money, it was the warning that the ground could be pulled out from under your feet. Dottie, who paid on time with her hospital wages, did sums on brown wrapping paper, adding and subtracting as if measuring her own breath. Mr. Yamamoto spent more time in the garden, as if trimming leaves could trim uncertainty. Leon Carter said on the corner that it was a way to drive out the regulars to make room for new people. Someone answered that new people were also people trying to live. The air grew heavy, and it was not only the smog. It was in that climate that music began to reorganize alliances, as if each house needed to declare which side it was on. On Saturday night, May 9th, Leon gathered two friends on his front step and put a Coaster's record on a portable turntable, powered by an extension cord run to an outlet. The sound came out loud, mixed with laughter and the distant noise of cars on Central, where traffic did not stop even at night. From a stucco building, Ray Henson answered with his radio, tuned to a country station. The two musics met in the middle of the street and collided, and children ran back and forth without understanding why adults stiffened when the neighbor's sound was different. Virgil, finishing a job for a truck driver, heard the mix and felt a discomfort he could not name. He was not against any music. In his youth, he had danced to halls with saxophone and drums. What unsettled him was sound as a territorial marker, as if each beat said, "This is mine." He closed the shop door and walked to the sidewalk, where Dottie watched from the same metal chair. She blew smoke and said noise was always the first sign of change. In mid-May, the block's morale was tested by something even more concrete. The garage church announced a welcome picnic for the newcomers from the South on Sunday, May 17th. The idea was simple: food, music, prayer, but the invitation, written in large letters and distributed door to door, sounded to some like a line drawn on the ground. Dottie received the paper and set it on top of the refrigerator without comment. Leon crumpled his and threw it into the corner trash can. Sheila pulled the invitation from the trash and smoothed it with her hands, hiding it in her room as if it were something forbidden. Virgil saw Sheila on the street that week, coming back from work in her Dinah uniform, hair pinned up, smelling of frying grease and reheated coffee. She stopped at the shop to ask him to look at her bicycle, which was making a strange noise. Virgil tipped the bike and adjusted the chain, tightening a nut and aligning the wheel with the motion of someone who did it without thinking. He noticed the folded invitation sticking out of her bag. He did not ask. Sheila had attentive eyes, like someone who listened more than she spoke, and on that street, listening too much could be as dangerous as talking. The catalyst came in the form of a letter delivered on a hot afternoon, May 22nd, 1959, when a wind brought dust and the smell of gasoline. The manager of the stucco building, and of other rentals as well, put envelopes in mailboxes, notices of adjustment, formal language, typed, an increase effective July 1st. Dottie opened hers on the porch and stood still, the paper trembling slightly. Mr. Yamamoto read his twice, slowly. Ray Henson, in the building, read and let out a low whistle. The increase was not only for some, it was for almost everyone. The street, already divided by music and church, now had a common enemy and a question that left no one in peace. Who would hold on? Who would leave? Who would accept worse conditions to stay? The increase pushed people against people because resources were limited and solidarity had invisible limits. Dottie, who had always helped neighbors with food when someone got sick, now did the math and saw that there might not be enough left to help anyone, not even with one extra plate. Ray, who had come from Texas with a promise of work, saw his wages vanish into rent before he even bought children's clothes. Leon, proud of never being late, thought about looking for another place, but knew other places would rise too, and that another place often meant farther from work and more spent on buses. The next Saturday, May 23rd, Virgil opened the shop earlier and put a hand-lettered sign on the door. Neighbors meeting, Sunday, May 24th, 5 p.m. at the shop. It was not something he usually did. He was a mechanic, not a leader. But he knew how to deal with parts that only worked together and with engines that needed fine adjustment not to blow. And the street, at that moment, felt like an engine knocking. On Sunday, as the sun began to drop and the shadows of the poles lengthened, people showed up. Dottie came with a notebook. Leon came with his arms crossed. Mr. Yamamoto came with clean hands and a straw hat. Ray Henson arrived with his wife, Marlene, and the boy. Others came too. People from small houses, rented rooms, cramped apartments where heat got trapped. The air smelled of oil and coffee because Virgil had set a thermos on the bench, the kind with glass inside, and simple cups. Virgil did not make a speech. He pointed to the envelopes and said it affected everyone. He said it might be possible to talk to the manager, ask for time, ask for maintenance in exchange, ask for a gradual increase. Dottie said she had seen it before. It went up a little, then more, until it was impossible. Leon said talking to the manager was useless, that the owner did not even live there. Ray, in a low voice, said that in Texas he had learned that when the boss decided, the ordinary man could only choose between accepting or looking for another corner. Marlene held the baby tighter and looked at the floor. What changed in that meeting was not the decision about rent. It was the sense that the divisions of music and church were small beside the larger threat. Even so, differences did not disappear. Leon did not trust Ray. Dottie did not trust the white pastor from the garage. Ray did not understand why Leon looked at him, as if he were an invader. Mr. Yamamoto watched calmly, like someone who had seen bigger waves and knew they did not ask permission. Virgil proposed a committee of 3 to speak with the manager on Monday. Dottie volunteered. Leon, after hesitating, volunteered. Ray did too. Ray's selection made Leon stiffen, but Dottie said that if it was a rent problem, they needed someone who also paid rent. Virgil wrote the names on a grease-stained piece of paper, and for an instant the street seemed capable of acting as one. On Monday, May 25th, 1959, they went to the manager's office, a small room behind a laundromat on Central, smelling of soap and steam and worn wooden chairs. The manager received them with a professional smile. He said he understood, but prices were rising everywhere, and he was only passing along instructions. Dottie spoke about maintenance, leaks, cracks, exposed wires. Leon spoke about wages that did not rise at the same pace, about overtime that did not always come. Ray spoke about children, about stability. The manager listened, shuffled papers, and said he could see what could be done for some cases. Maybe a month's grace, maybe nothing. In the end, he offered something concrete and cruelly selective. Anyone who paid 3 months in advance would not face the increase until October. It was impossible for almost everyone, and at the same time, a test of who had reserves and who did not. When they left, midday light hit the asphalt hard. Leon spat on the ground, angry. Dottie put away her notebook like someone putting away a document of defeat. Ray stood still, watching cars pass, and said maybe he would have to work more hours. No one had a victory to take home. Only the certainty that the city had its rules and they did not bend from fatigue. The garage church picnic happened anyway, on Sunday, May 31st, at small Ted Watkins Park in Watts, with wooden tables and a hard-packed dirt field, little shade and thin grass in spots. The day was hot, and the smell of charcoal and grilled meat spread, mixed with dust and cheap perfume. The church brought guitars, and people clapped. Ray and Marlene went. Sheila, defying her mother, said she was going to take a look and left in a simple dress, the invitation hidden in her pocket. Dottie noticed, but did not shout. She only pressed her mouth shut and stayed on the porch, looking at the empty street, as if the absence of footsteps were easier to bear than an argument. At the park, Sheila saw something she had not seen on the street. Black and white children running together after a ball, without anyone separating them, at least in that space and that moment. She saw Marlene offering potato salad to a Mexican woman who had come with her children. She saw men with calloused hands laughing at a work story. The music was different, but the tiredness on faces was the same. Sheila stayed near the tables, shy, and ended up helping serve lemonade in paper cups. A boy from Arkansas, with freckles and a plaid shirt, thanked her without looking too much. The pastor spoke loudly about unity, but Sheila paid more attention to the hands reaching for food because that was where real life showed itself. When the sun began to drop, someone brought out a bottle of liquor hidden in a paper bag. It was not supposed to be there. The pastor pretended not to see. Some men drank quickly, as if they needed courage for the next day. The tension of rent, work, displacement, everything seemed to demand a release valve. It was on the way back from the park, that same night of May 31st, 1959, that the event happened that the street would not be able to undo. Leon Carter was driving a friend's 1949 Chevrolet, carrying two young men who had gone to the park out of curiosity and for the music. He had not drunk much, but he had drunk enough to loosen his body and weaken his judgment. Ray Henson came behind in an old Plymouth borrowed from a Goodyear co-worker, with Marlene and the boy in the back seat, without seat belts, as was common. Avalon Boulevard was full of cars returning from Sunday outings. The air was heavy, and the street lights made yellow patches on the windshield. At the corner of 103rd and Avalon, a boy ran across chasing a ball that had gotten away. Leon braked hard. The car skidded a little. Ray, behind, tried to swerve and hit the Chevrolet's rear with a dry crash of metal. The impact was not big enough to crumple much, but it was big enough to throw Marlene forward. The baby cried, the boy screamed. Leon got out of the car angry, adrenaline rising as if it had been stored for weeks. The two men stood in the middle of the street under the yellow light, with cars honking and drivers trying to get through. Leon accused Ray of riding too close. Ray accused Leon of braking without warning. The words came fast, sharp. There were no explicit slurs in the first sentence, but all the weight of the previous weeks was there. One of the young men in Leon's car laughed nervously and said something about hillbillies who did not know how to drive in the city. Ray stepped forward. Leon shoved him. Ray answered with a short punch that caught Leon on the chin. Leon fell sideways and hit his head on the curb with a hollow sound that Marlene heard even over the baby's crying. For a second, no one moved. Then Marlene shouted Ray's name like an order. Ray stood frozen, staring at Leon on the ground, eyes wide, and then knelt as if the gesture could turn back time. A driver stopped and ran to a payphone. The ambulance took time because it was Sunday night and the streets were full, and because care depended on calls and travel through traffic. When it arrived, Leon was conscious but confused, trying to speak, and missing the words. One pupil did not seem to track the light. The responders put on a cervical collar and took him away, and the siren receded down Avalon like a sound that solved nothing, only marking that something had gone past the point of return. On the morning of Monday, June 1st, 1959, the news was already on every porch. Leon Carter, the man of the records in the corner, was hospitalized at Los Angeles County General Hospital with a head injury, and doctors had told the family the next 48 hours would be decisive, as if time were a machine that could fail completely. Police had gone to the stucco building and taken Ray Henson away in handcuffs, while Marlene held the baby and the boy cried without understanding why his father could not go inside to get his own things. The street, already under pressure from rent and change, now carried a different kind of emptiness. Not the emptiness of an absent body, but that of a life suspended, hanging on invisible wires, and a guilty man who was also a neighbor. Virgil learned early, because a police car stopped in front of the shop and one of the officers asked if he knew Ray. Virgil said yes, that he was a recent resident. The officer wrote it down and left. Virgil stood still, looking at the hydraulic lift, as if the machine could give an answer. He was not a close friend of Leon's, but he knew the sound of his laugh, the way he tapped his foot to the music. Now the corner seemed emptier than it should have. On Tuesday, June 2nd, Dottie went to Los Angeles County General Hospital after her shift, still smelling of kitchen in her hair, bringing Sheila. The hospital, on Marengo Street, had corridors that smelled of disinfectant and old fear, with people sitting on benches waiting for their names to be called. Leon lay in a ward with low light, his head bandaged, and the swelling in his face erased part of who he was. Leon's mother, sitting with her purse in her lap, stared at a fixed point on the wall. A doctor explained, in an unadorned voice, that Leon might survive, but permanent damage was possible. Speech, memory, fine control of the hands. He spoke as if describing an engine that had lost parts and might run, but never the same. On the way back to 103rd, Sheila did not cry loudly. Her silence had weight. Dottie held her daughter's hand hard, as if holding on so she would not slip away. At home, Dottie did not turn on the radio. That night, the porch had no lit cigarette. Ray, in jail, had no way to see Leon or to explain anything beyond what he had already said at the scene, voice broken and hands shaking. Marlene stayed home because she had nowhere to go. The building manager appeared that same week and left a note on the door. Late rent would not be tolerated. Marlene crumpled the note and threw it in the trash, then pulled it back out and smoothed it because she needed the paper to remember what she owed. She went to Virgil's shop on June 6th, with the baby on her hip and the boy by the hand. She asked, in a low voice, if Virgil could look at the borrowed Plymouth, because she needed to return it in good condition. Virgil looked at the dented bumper and said he could try to straighten it, but bent metal did not become new again. He said it looking at the car, but Marlene understood it was about more than that. The consequence of Ray's punch was immediate and spread like a crack in glass. The street split in a deeper way than music. Some said Ray was violent, that he had brought trouble. Others said it was an accident, that anyone could have fallen wrong. Police asked questions, and the word assault appeared in low conversations, along with fear of testimony and retaliation. The garage church pastor tried to visit Dottie, but she did not open the door. The rent committee dissolved without announcement. The manager sensed the disorganization and offered nothing more. Virgil, in the middle of it, watched the block change its language. People crossed the street to avoid passing in front of the stucco building. Children were called inside before dark. The music dropped in volume for a while, as if everyone feared provoking the next person. And at the same time, the rent increase remained set for July 1st, indifferent to the hospital and the precinct. On June 18, 1959, a court letter arrived from Marlene, informing her of a preliminary hearing date for Ray downtown at the Hall of Justice on Temple Street. Marlene had no money for a private lawyer. A public defender would be assigned, as was the path for those who could not pay. She brought the letter to Virgil, because Virgil was the only man on the street who spoke calmly and had a car go downtown if needed. Virgil read the letter slowly and handed it back. He said he could drive her to court that day, if she needed. Marlene nodded without excessive thanks. Shame would not allow it. Dottie, meanwhile, began selling small things to gather money for the new rent. She sold an extra radio, a set of dishes. Sheila took more shifts to the diner. Mr. Yamamoto, silent, put up a small sign in the yard, room for rent, because he needed someone to share costs in a neighborhood where sharing a house became a quick solution. The sign came down in 2 days when a man arrived and offered money up front. It was one more stranger coming in, now not for hope, but for opportunity. On Saturday, June 27th, Virgil stayed late at the shop fixing a delivery truck. The sky was clear, and the day's heat still rose from the asphalt. He heard footsteps on the sidewalk and saw Sheila standing at the door, holding her bicycle. She asked, in a voice almost inaudible, for him to tighten the brake. Virgil did the job in silence. When he finished, Sheila stood looking at the bench, the tools lined up. She said Leon used to stand on the corner listening to music, and now the corner felt wrong, as if it had lost its balance point. Virgil did not answer with comfort. He only said the street would have to learn another way to stand. Sheila nodded and rode away slowly, as if every yard required care. On July 1st, 1959, the increase went into effect. The manager came early, collecting envelopes. Some doors stayed closed, not in protest, but in absence. 2 families had left the night before, moving furniture in silence so as not to draw attention, leaving clear marks on the floor where cabinets had stood. The moving truck did not choke. It was fast, professional, as if the city already had practiced at this. Dottie paid, but had less left than ever. Marlene paid late, with money borrowed from a woman at the garage church, which angered some neighbors even more when they found out. Mr. Yamamoto began sharing the house with a man who worked construction and came home late, making noise with boots and tools. The street filled with new sounds, not from music but from survival. Ray's hearing took place on July 9th, 1959. Virgil drove Marlene and the children downtown, passing the Harbor Freeway with sections under construction and heavy flow, seeing tall buildings and hurried people. In court, the air was cold and smelled of paper, ink, and contained sweat. Ray appeared in simple clothes, handcuffed, looking at the floor. Marlene did not cry. She stayed rigid, as if rigidity could prevent collapse. The public defender spoke of accident, provocation, lack of intent. The prosecutor spoke of violence and risk to life. The preliminary decision kept Ray jailed until trial, with bail too high to be paid. At the end of July, an update reached the block that no one celebrated. Leon had survived, but he left Los Angeles County General Hospital with slow, uneven speech and a weaker right side, as if his body had lost part of its command. He returned to his mother's house a few streets north, because he could not climb the steps at his old rental without help. When he appeared for the first time on the sidewalk on a muggy afternoon, he wore a hat to hide the scar and leaned his weight on a cousin's arm. The corner where he stood remained the corner, but the body that had given the place its meaning now crossed the street like someone measuring each step. The street did not know how to receive that. For some, Leon's survival was a relief that came with a cost, because the cost was visible every day. For others, it was reason to harden even more against Ray, because now there was a living man to point to what had been taken from him. Leon did not speak much. When he did, The words came out like parts that had to be searched for in a box. The smile he tried to make did not fit his face the same way. The trial came at the end of summer. In September 1959, the charge was treated as aggravated assault, based on the injury and the disability doctors called permanent, recorded in clinical terms and repeated in courtroom language. No funeral was needed to make Ray's absence definitive. The sentence was years in state prison, long enough to turn waiting into routine. Virgil heard the news on a hot afternoon, the tube radio hissing between a traffic bulletin and a tire advertisement. Marlene received confirmation in the kitchen, with the baby already walking in short steps and the boy quieter than he should have been. She sat on the bed and stared at her hands. Virgil, called later, found her without tears, only with the expression of someone calculating the next week. The sentence meant the boy would grow up without his father at the table. It meant the stucco building, already hostile, would become untenable. It also meant Leon, alive, would have to learn a new body knowing exactly why the old one had been lost. In October, Marlene decided to leave. She did not go back to Texas because she had neither the money nor the pride for that. She went to an aunt's house in Bakersfield, where there was harvest work and less rent for the time being, and where distance at least seemed to reduce stares. On October 12, 1959, a small truck stopped in front of the building. Marlene carried boxes of clothes, a disassembled crib, a Bible. The boy held the little tin truck now dented. Sheila helped carry a suitcase to the truck, saying little. Dottie watched from the porch, face tired, and did not stop her daughter. Virgil showed up with a screwdriver to loosen the crib's plate and did the job quickly, as if speed could lessen the pain. When the truck pulled away, it raised dust. Marlene's apartment window was left empty, without the flowered curtain. 2 days later, the manager arrived with a new tenant, another man from the South, this time alone, working at the refinery in Wilmington. He went in without looking to either side. The street had no time to breathe between one story and the next. By the end of that year, with Christmas approaching and Los Angeles' mild cold bringing damper nights, the corner where Leon used to stand never became exactly the same again. Leon was sometimes brought out to the sidewalk, seated in a folding chair, listening to music low, as if loud volume might knock something loose inside. His right arm trembled when he tried to hold a cup. The young men who had once laughed loudly near him now spoke more softly, and no one leaned on the pole the same way. Dottie kept paying the increased rent, cutting expenses, bringing food home in small containers from the hospital when there were leftovers, a discreet practice of someone who could not waste. Sheila saved enough to buy a used sewing machine in November and began doing alterations for neighbors, hemming pants and church dresses, charging little and writing it down in a notebook. Mr. Yamamoto kept the rose bushes, even with the noisy new tenant, as if the flowers were a way of insisting that something could remain. Virgil kept opening the shop before sunrise, listening to the tube radio hiss between traffic news and tire ads. Sometimes, when the wind came from the south, it carried the smell of sea and oil from the refineries. He remembered April, the moving truck choking in gear, the music facing off in the air, the rent increase paper trembling in Dottie's hand. He also remembered the hollow sound on the curb, not as an ending, but as an irreversible change, and the way the city, indifferent, kept collecting rent while one man relearned how to speak and another family packed boxes to leave. The street had learned, harshly, that alliances made out of necessity could come apart in seconds, and that the price of staying in a place was measured in money and in wear. On New Year's Eve, December 31st, 1959, Virgil closed the shop early and walked to the corner. The sky was clear, and the city seemed louder farther north. But there the block continued as always. Parked cars, cracked sidewalks, the yellow streetlights coming on before 6. On the porch, Dottie sat in the metal chair, a blanket over her shoulders. Sheila was inside, sewing. The machine made a steady sound you could hear from the sidewalk. Farther on, at Leon's mother's house, a window was open just enough to let out a piece of music, low and even, as if someone were testing their own presence. Somewhere on the block, laughter came from a backyard, without a battle of volume, as if everyone had learned that certain things drew too much attention. Virgil stood for a few minutes, looking at the stucco building and the corner where Leon used to lean. There was nothing to fix there that night. The rent committee was over, Ray was in prison, Marlene was gone, and the increase had become routine. Virgil went home when the air cooled, locked the door, washed his hands longer than he needed to, and went to bed early because work would start before the sun. The next day, the block woke up, buses passed along Central. The manager went back to collecting envelopes on other streets, and the shop opened as always, with Virgil lifting the metal door and waiting for the first car to pull in, the same way he had all year. No celebration, no promise, only the certainty that some broken things kept working in some way, and that on that ordinary street. 1959 ended, leaving marks that did not disappear, only learn how to fit into daily life. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking the video. It helps ensure that these quiet, often forgotten stories continue to be shared. Subscribe to Ordinary Lives, Extraordinary Times to stay connected to stories of everyday people who lived through moments that shaped history. Each life mattered. Each story deserves to be remembered. We also invite you to leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Our viewers come from many places and generations, connected by a shared respect for history and the lives that lived it. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.